Welcome to the Great Basin seasonal outlook for May through August. Over the last 30 days, we've seen cooler temperatures across much of the Great Basin, and we've seen drier conditions over northern Nevada into Utah. The only wetter spots have been over parts of central Idaho into Wyoming, where the storm track has been targeting the last few weeks, bringing cooler temperatures and a little bit of light precipitation. And then we did have some storms earlier in the month over southern areas of the Great Basin, especially into Southern California, bringing those areas well above normal for precipitation. We did have some of that precipitation move into southern Nevada and southwest Utah and the Arizona Strip. Looking at the precipitation since the beginning of the water year, we are showing generally below normal precipitation across much of the west. The only exception is over southern areas of the Great Basin into Southern California and Arizona, where we are seeing that above normal precipitation, both with precipitation that occurred in November, December last year, and also what we've been seeing recently over southern areas earlier this month. Further north, where the storm track has really been targeting for some time, precipitation is just near normal for the time of year in spots across Idaho and Wyoming. However, we also have to take into account the previous water year, taking us into the fire season of 2019, where we had well above normal precipitation over the southern half of the Great Basin. This brought us a larger than normal fine fuel crop, so we did see some areas reporting fine fuels of 100 to 300% going into last fire season. We will have to deal with a lot of these fine fuels going into this fire season, as we did see below normal precipitation and very few low elevation snowstorms that would have compacted those fine fuels, at least in a widespread area. So we are expecting those fine fuels to be a problem this year as carryover fuels going into the fire season. Looking at our current snowpack, we are seeing generally near normal conditions over Idaho, Wyoming, and down into northern Utah, and below normal snowpack for the rest of the western Great Basin. This snowpack will obviously continue to dwindle here over the coming weeks and coming months as we see warmer temperatures, and we will see that snowpack melt. The soil moisture shows the dry conditions we've seen over northern Nevada into Utah, so that's where the lowest soil moistures in the Great Basin are. We are seeing very dry conditions over northern California into western Nevada just due to recent dry weather, and a little bit higher soil moisture in the far south due to recent storms. However, our evaporative demand drought index is not showing any significant flash drought concerns across the west. But we still do have some longer term drought to deal with. We are seeing some abnormally dry conditions and some moderate drought over parts of Nevada into Utah and also over parts of central Idaho. And looking at the outlook, these drought areas will likely persist, if not also start to expand and develop over parts of the Pacific Northwest into northwest Nevada. Looking at our 10-hour fuel moisture, again, the conditions have been dry and warm across southern half to 2/3 of the Great Basin, so that's where our lowest 10-hour fuel moistures are, and they're quite a bit higher over Idaho and Wyoming, where we've seen those storm systems move across, bringing cooler temperatures and some light precipitation. We're seeing a similar trend in the 100-hour fuel moisture and also in the 1,000-hour fuel moistures, where conditions are quite a bit wetter further north and drier over the southern half of the region. We are seeing fuels also start to cure out over the southern half of the Great Basin, so we will see those cured fuels raise in elevation here over the coming weeks, so we'll be looking for that drier trend over southern areas. Looking at some of our experimental fuel model projections from last year, this is from last July, so the image on the bottom right shows the percent of normal fine fuel loading, in relation to normal. So the darker greens are well above normal for fine fuel loading, and some of the lighter greens and browns are not as much below, or not as much above normal. But really we're seeing at least normal to well above normal fine fuel conditions, and again, this was going into last fire season. So we do have a couple new projections, and again, this is all experimental, but it does kind of paint the picture of where we are with fine fuel loading. So we have the carryover to deal with. So this was 2019. Again, you can see this is a little bit different scale, but looking at the greens and blues, those are generally the areas where the fine fuels were above normal in 2019. And then looking at 2020, we have a lot more greens and blues on the map. So this is, again, just showing southern Nevada into Utah, Arizona, and southern California right now. This was the only image we had available, but it is showing how that trend's a little bit different. So we do have a little bit more fine fuel loading this year than we did last year. We have heard some people compare last year and this year to 2005, and there are quite a few stark differences. We had a lot more precipitation in 2005 than we did in the last 2 years combined, and so kind of looking at the difference, if we did put 2005 up there, this would be the fine fuel loading map, just doing experimental, taking that data from 2005. So again, we're not really in the ballpark of 2005, but we will be looking at some above normal fine fuel crops. So putting everything together that we've learned and kind of looking a little bit into the future projections, talking about La Nina and El Nino, we are generally seeing neutral conditions in the ocean, and we have been seeing that for some time. Looking at some of the projections, there is quite a bit of uncertainty as we get into the fall. So the left part of the image where the dots first appear, that's where we currently are. And then as we go through the next several months, it does look like it's more of a trend for a cooling bias, but possibly still staying in that neutral phase for several months yet. As we get into the fall, again, things get a lot more uncertain. We have a lot more spread in the models, some staying in the warm phase, going into El Nino, and many are either staying in neutral or going into the cooler phase. So that looks like the trend we will be seeing. Now, how that impacts our summer, generally when we're in these neutral conditions, we see more of a transitory pattern, so we will have storms moving through, giving us some cooler temperatures, some potential of wind, and also some showers and thunderstorms. Now looking at our 8 to 14 day outlook, taking us from May 7th through the 13th, showing warm temperatures in the west and drier conditions over the northern half of the region, with some wetter conditions down into parts of the southwest, which may impact southern Utah, but for the most part we're looking at drier conditions through the month of May and warm temperatures. As we move into throughout the entire month, we are again showing that generally warm conditions. Any of the wetter conditions would be further east. And as we get into the June through August time period, again, we're still looking at warmer temperatures and dry conditions. We may see some periods of wetter conditions, especially over the eastern half of the Great Basin as we get later in that period. But right now what it's looking like is we'll have a solid period of time throughout May into June where we see warm temperatures and dry conditions to really start critically drying out our fuels. As we move towards monsoon season, it looks like the monsoon might be a little bit delayed or weaker this year. So we will be watching that because that certainly will impact our outlook for eastern areas of the Great Basin. But right now, the potential is there for a slightly delayed monsoon, keeping things drier and warmer for a little bit longer. So putting everything together, here are our next few slides are our outlook for the next few months. For the month of May, we're just looking at normal conditions. We may see some above normal fire potential start to peak up over southern areas of the Great Basin later this month as we see those fuels cure out here over the next few weeks in the south with those warm and dry conditions. Again, we might start to see that above normal potential start to develop in the far south, but likely that will be throughout the month of June. So we do have above normal fire potential for the Arizona Strip, southern Utah, and southern Nevada, mainly in the low to mid elevations, again where that fine fuel crop exists. But we are also seeing some drier spots in our timber areas as well, especially into parts of Nevada. Southern Utah, we still have some snowpack, so that will take a little bit more time in the higher elevations. By July, if we do see that delayed monsoon, we will continue to see that above normal potential creep a little bit further north into Utah and remain in the south, at least for the first couple of weeks in July before the monsoon really starts to take shape. And then we will start to see over western areas that above normal fire potential increase. Fuels will take some time to dry out over western areas in Nevada and Idaho, so that will likely occur throughout the month of May and June, and then we'll really start to see fires pick up as we get into July, which timing-wise would be about normal for our large fires in those areas. But due to the grass crop, we could see those larger fires become a little bit more problematic. And then in August, we will continue that above normal threat over the western side of the Great Basin, with above normal now moving into parts of the central Idaho mountains. Once that snowpack does melt and soil moistures dry out along with the fuels, we could see some problem areas, especially in the foothills. However, over eastern areas of the Great Basin, likely see things return to normal, assuming that monsoon does eventually materialize and bring some rainfall to the eastern side. So that concludes our webcast for this month. Check back on June 1st for our next Outlook.